Hi, everyone. Welcome to English 4113 for class 22. We're going to be talking about beloved. We'll be talking about the timeline of the book and time and memory, and also a bit about Margaret Garner and morality. This is an image of the Sawara dance ceremony of the Bambara and Mali, aka it's the antelope dance. So this is a modern version of it. And the antelope dance figures in Beloved. So you can just click on the PowerPoint to watch a video of that dance, or you can just look it up on YouTube, which is what I did. So let me walk you through the timeline of the book. Morrison is fairly precise about when events take place. Most things are taking place in 1855 and 1873. The novel concludes in 1874, but the earliest clearly described details of the novel occur in 1795. And so here it is in the chronological timeline of things. Baby Suggs is born in 1795. Setha, note the pronunciation of her name, is born in 1836, maybe in the Carolinas, maybe in Louisiana. Baby Suggs arrives at Sweet Home, Kentucky in 1839. She has a hurt hip. She also has a 10-year-old son, the last of her children who's with her, who's Halla. And she's given the name Jenny by Lillian Garner. So that's the last name she has while she's still enslaved. 1848, maybe Setha, who's 13 years old, arrives at Sweet Home. Her mother at some point was burned to death, either in Carolina or Louisiana. 1849, a year later, Setha's 14 years old. She marries Halla, who's by this point age 20. And she says they have 6 full years of marriage, so that helps you figure out the timeline. Howard, the first of their children, is born. Then Bugler is born in 1851. And then Beloved, the third of their children, is born in 1853. We never learn her given name. Beloved is the only name we ever know her by. That's the name that's carved on the headstone. So Beloved. Baby Suggs is free in 1854 by Halla's labor. So he's been working on weekends, on Sundays, and to free his mother. And the Garners are willing to honor that promise. When she's freed, she insists on being named Baby Suggs. 1855 is the Great Escape. Setha, who's about age 19 or perhaps 20 at this point, flees from Kentucky into Ohio. Denver is born. 28 days later, the slave catchers show up. Beloved is killed. The 2 sons are wounded. Halla, meanwhile, goes mad, and Paul D is tortured with a bit in his mouth. 1855 is a very eventful year. 1856, Paul D is sold away from the Garner plantation to a man named Brandywine. He tries to kill him, so he's sent to Alfred, Georgia to break rocks 18 days after that, and so he's imprisoned for a while. Then the American Civil War happens, 1860 to 1865. Then in 1862, at some point here, about 12 years before 1874, Denver studies in school, at Lady Jones's school, and then she's deaf for about 2 years. It's kind of a post-traumatic stress syndrome. And really what means she can't go to school anymore is really a lot of lingering resentment and terror over Setha's killing of Beloved. And there's a ghost in the house of some sort as well. 1864, Bugler and Howard run away. So they're about 13 years old when they do. Baby Suggs also dies sometime around 1864 because Setha tells Paul D that she's been dead for about 9 years. 1866, Paul D starts heading in the direction of House 124, so towards Cincinnati. And then 1873 is when the book opens. At that point, Denver is 18 years old, and Beloved is about 20 years old, sort of, when she comes back. And then the novel concludes in 1874. So thinking about time, one of the things the novel is about is the way that the present and the past are not separate, particularly in the time of slavery, or living in what Christina Sharp called living in the wake of slavery, in the way that trauma just collapses present and past in all kinds of ways, and that the touch of slavery upon the present is closer oftentimes than most people think. So you may or may not have seen Dave Chappelle's monologue on Saturday Night Live on November 7th, so the evening after the election had been called for Biden. And he's telling a story about his great-grandfather who was enslaved when he was born and was enslaved for first 10 years of his life. And I'm not going to read this because I'm not Chappelle, I can't do it. But he became an educated man and dedicated himself, as Chappelle says, to education, freedom of Black people, Jesus Christ. And Chappelle imagines his great-grandfather coming and seeing him that evening in Saturday Night Live, and you expect, this is going to be a story of uplift and how his grandfather is so proud of him, great-grandfather is so proud of him. And it's possible, of course, for Chappelle to have a great-grandfather who was born into slavery. Dave Chappelle is about 4 years younger than me, and I have a great-grandfather who was born in the early 19th century, married late in the 70s, and had some children then. Some other relatives of mine. So it's entirely possible. Maybe that was my great-grandfather. At any rate, it's possible. The joke here is, of course, that Chappelle's imagining that his great-grandfather would be disappointed to find that his descendant is still being treated terribly and that the legacy of slavery is continuing in some way. So you'll just have to listen to it or read the transcript to see the actual joke. To give you another sense of the way that the memories of slavery and the defense of slavery remain present in American consciousness, you of course know that over this year, there's been a lot of dismantling of monuments to the Confederacy and monuments to slavery. And one of the things that people need to be aware of is when these monuments were erected. So there are thousands and thousands of them, whether we're talking about plaques or statues or military bases named after Confederate generals or schools named after Confederate politicians or generals. So we have most of these being erected in the period around the early 20th century. So one of the most heightened periods of white terrorism against Black people in this country. So there's a period of relative political liberation for Black people in the immediate post-war period for about 15 years. And then in 1876, the federal government pulls its troops out and lets the South once again govern itself. And what that means is that Black civil rights are shut down for more than a century. And there's an enormous, terrible period of terror. And this is commemorated by monuments to the Confederacy. And then that dies down a little bit as the white Southerners, I guess, become more certain that they've finally, in a way, won the Civil War. But then civil rights struggle really kicks off, and you can see these monuments being built again. They're always being built then against, not just in celebration of the Confederacy, but also as the Confederacy was itself, as a blow against Black freedom. So bear that in mind in terms of the presence of the past and the way that the past is still with us. So now turning to Beloved, I constructed this really cheesy word cloud using an online tool where I just used the entire text of Morrison's novel, fed it into the system, and I made this graphical image. You can see where each word that has a relative size according to how often it's used in the novel. Obviously, Seth's name is the most frequently used word in the novel. I'm also struck by house being used so frequently, and never, and time. These are important words. Words of time are indeed very important to this book. So then I fed the text of the novel into a bit of indexing software, the index generator here, which you can find online. I find it's very, very useful. At least I used it for my last book to help put together the index. And here's what I found in terms of uses of words that have to do with time. Yesterday gets used 4 times, today 8 times, tomorrow 7 times, future 9 times, and then dead, which is I think a word that has to do with time, is something really in the past 87 times, dies really 33 times, if you can count died and dies, forget 19 times, memory 23 times, remembrance and remember 50 times. It's a lot. 19 times for rememory, which is a word that Morrison coins. Remind is 13 times, till 24 times, interesting word. Time itself, 204 times, years, 95 times, never, 197 times. This is a novel that's about time and about the way that that Setha's 1855 experience and her 1873 experience are not very far apart at all. This helps explain one of the reasons why Morrison writes the novel in the way she does, where almost the entire plot of the novel, everything that happens in it, is almost all there in the first 20 pages, because there is no clear sense that the past and present are separate in this novel. It's a novel about haunting, right? And so it isn't all bad, though, to say that the past and the present are connected, right? If you participated in the Black Lives Matter protests this summer, as I did, you know that one of the things that is happening there is the insistence that the past not be allowed to remain in the past, that the movement to say his name or to say her name is to ensure that that person's life is known as something worth remembering, right? A Black life mattering is to remember it and to insist on it as something that's worth mourning and remembering, and to keep telling that story in the present, not to let it simply disappear into the past. And so when marching and we were called upon to kneel for the amount of time that George Floyd was kneeled upon by police officers, so the time it took for him to be choked to death, what we were doing in that moment was kind of recreating the experience of his death, but in a moment of reverence and understanding that he wasn't granted at that time when he was being killed. So I find that memory can also be an act of resistance. We even have a slight memory in some cases in this novel of African ceremony, of the antelope dance. And so when there's various references to antelopes, which I got from Shirley Stave, Toni Morrison in the Bible, Contested Intertextualities, this is part of what's going on. Denver it's almost like she has hooves when she's a little infant in the womb. This is a reference to this fertility dance. How could Seth have known about it? She couldn't have, possibly, unless her mother maybe told her about it, or maybe it's just this sort of vague memory. But again, there's some kind of connection she has to a culture that existed before her enslavement in America. So that's something maybe to think about as well, is that memory is not necessarily a site of trauma. It can be a site of resistance. So the last thing I want to talk about in this brief talk, I hope, is the morality of Margaret Garner and of Setha's killing of their infant. So I've shared this image with you before, this very popular image, Am I Not a Man and a Brother? Professor Matthew also shared that image with you in her talk last Thursday. And again, we have a suppliant, an enslaved man in chains looking up at us, presumably someone who has the ability to free them, who needs to be taught how to answer this question with a yes. So presumably a white person who's a little bit soft about the resistance to slavery, and you're supposed to go, oh my God, yes, you too are a man and a brother. Here, let me help you. But as I said with my talk about the Haitian Revolution, what happens to this white person when they're seeing images of Black people helping themselves, of overthrowing their enemies? How do we answer, how is this question posed if we imagine it being attached to this situation of Margaret Garner killing her children rather than letting them go into slavery and saying, look what you did, or look what the system made me do, or even look what I did. Am I not a woman and a sister, right? The question gets posed in a different way. The morality of the situation becomes interesting and complicated and much, much more challenging to a white liberal's sense of their own inherent goodness, because they have to understand that their own system of goodness is predicated on a certain softness about what it is they're going to allow a Black person to do to resist the situation of violence that they are caught in. So I'm thinking in particular here of an article I just read by Jared Sexton, a book called an article called Affirmation in the Dark, Racial Slavery and Philosophical Pessimism, in a journal called The Comparativist, 43.1, came out last year, 2019, pages 90 to 111. Jared Sexton belongs to the school of thought known as Afropessimism. So I've shared the Frank Wilderson book with you a number of times, the book Afropessimism. We're going to be reading some Saidiya Hartman. She also belongs to this philosophical school in various ways. There's also people like Christina Sharp. And Jared Sexton's another key figure in this. He's a very sophisticated writer and works at the University of California, Irvine. And so here's a little bit of what he had to say in this article. He's talking about the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche, writes Sexton, formulates his own notion of Dionysian pessimism. Here he's contrasting Nietzsche with the German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer. Dionysian pessimism, a joyous embrace of the bad news that the world is not simply fallen, which would only amplify the quest for redemption, but it also beyond the dialectic of corruption and purification altogether. So Nietzsche, here it is in Sexton's summary, is saying, once you realize that everything is screwed up, maybe rather than trying to return it to proper morality, you should understand that the very systems of morality that exist are designed to ensure that the powerful remain powerful and the weak remain weak. And to the extent that the weak accept that morality that's being taught to them, they are accepting the morality that keeps them in their place. So keep this in mind for thinking about Margaret Garner. There's some joy then in trying to overthrow the entire system. Nietzsche chafes against the fact that the slaves' revolt takes place in the register of morality. If we say that the slaves are revolting because they are protesting against immorality, then the slaves are simply operating according to the rules that have been given them by their slave masters. We can see, for example, in Hawkesworth's version of Orinoco wants to resist that revolt because he recognizes himself as property. He thinks it would be immoral for him to try to, quote unquote, steal himself. Equiano is very insistent on buying himself because in many ways, Equiano is a good capitalist. Nietzsche would look at that and say, that's just not good enough, right? It may have worked to a certain extent, but it's not going to overthrow the entire system. So to start this again, Nietzsche chafes against the fact that the slaves' revolt takes place in the register of morality as an imaginary revenge in which the enslaved and their unearned worldly suffering are deemed morally good in the eyes of God, and their enslavers are deemed morally evil, slating each respectively for redemption and condemnation in the afterlife. So all good people go to heaven, all bad people go to hell. And that all these fights are being done about questions of transhistorical notions of good and evil. But Nietzsche says, no, they should take place in the field of battle, where the proper responsive action might transform the material and symbolic order of things, what Nietzsche calls a transvaluation of all values. Everything we think of as good and evil needs to be rethought. Hence, he has a book called Beyond Good and Evil. So Nietzsche finally says the slaves revolt thwarts itself from within to the extent that the constituency, that is those enslaved people, becomes attached to morality itself and to the corollary preoccupation with survival, because morality is really about the fundamental value of life. But there needs to be a value that's beyond life that we can attach ourselves to, something that we commit ourselves to that's beyond any existing morality and beyond any existing connection to life. At least this is what Nietzsche is saying. And I think we can see that Margaret Garner's blow against slavery is a properly Nietzschean revolt, a transvaluation of all values, saying that as a mother, her response to slavery can be to undo herself as a mother, but simultaneously claim these children as hers, as a mother and not as a mother simultaneously. What moral system can possibly make sense of what it is that Margaret Garner did? And what happens when we ask this question of morality, am I not a man and a brother, when it's emerging from her mouth? Here, imagine a little balloon, am I not a sister? Am I not a woman and a sister? How does this understand? How can this possibly be understood? What is the morality of what she's doing? I'm not saying that she's immoral. I'm not saying that she's moral. I'm saying that what she's done has shattered those terms and demands a complete reevaluation of the entire system of ownership, motherhood, and morality. Okay, looking forward to our conversation tomorrow.